Hello. Works well? Okay. Thank you for inviting me here. As Andrea said, when I was ED of Sécudère, we did 4 court cases against the Energy East pipeline. So I came at this very much trying to fight bad projects that were trying to be rammed through bad processes. And for the last 2 years, I've moved on to trying to build better processes to try to ensure that only good projects get approved in this country. I wished I'd picked another challenge, to be honest, but we're making progress. So just a quick flashback to 2012. The Harper government gutted environmental laws to try to speed exports of our oil. That that was actually evidenced through access to information requests. That it was the oil industry wish list that resulted in those reforms. So. As Dale mentioned in his presentation, we have a massive gap between the big climate commitments we made at Paris and the actual decisions that we take on projects going forward in Canada. We can call it a contradiction, a dissonance. I just go for gap. This is just not about. This is not about just which projects are going to go forward, but it's also about which project we're going to fund with our taxpayer money, as the Trans Mountain Pipeline has just demonstrated. And so what we're trying to put in this law is what activists have called a climate test, which is ensuring projects are consistent with a scenario that allows us to achieve our Paris commitment, something that's never been done in this country and hasn't really been done in any countries, I think. So I'll focus on the assessment law, but just to say that this is also very relevant for the new infrastructure bank that was created in 2017. It is meant to invest $15 billion in public transit, trade, transport corridors, and $5 billion for green infrastructure projects. I haven't seen so far any indicators of how they want to funnel those investments to ensure they reach the goals that are set to be reached. And it's slightly worrying because a report by the Auditor General in 2016 showed that the green funds that were funneled to municipality to try to bring forward pollution reduction and sustainability had no way of showing whether they had actually achieved their purposes, because there were no indicators, nothing to report on. So we have no idea if it actually worked. And the Auditor General found that the department was consistently underestimating environmental risks, such as climate change, in the infrastructure we build. So it's pretty important that we build infrastructure that can last the next century and won't collapse because there's a flood or it was built in a flood zone or things like that. So Bill C-60, oops, too quick. Canada's proposed Impact Assessment Act, Bill C-69, just a little joke. Us working on environmental assessment law reform, we call it eyes glaze over law because it tends to be very technical and slightly boring, except for the few enthusiasts that we are. So when the bill was introduced and its number was 69, we're like, yes, now it's just gotten interesting. So, the part of the act that I'm most excited about is that now it explicitly says that when we approve or review projects, we must consider whether the designated project contributes to the Government of Canada's ability to meet its environment obligations and its commitments in respect of climate change. This is also in the broader context of contributing to sustainability. I won't even go into the other ones, they're boring. But so this is a win because no previous assessment act specifically referred to climate change. And so we always had to fight to include climate change into assessments. We also know that the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers is officially trying to remove this section of the act. They do not want us to talk about climate when we review projects for obvious reasons. And this may be one of the main reasons why they're behind a campaign to try to kill Bill C-69 in the Senate. Another positive news, through engagement at the House of Commons stage, through committee review, amendments were proposed to make sure that this climate factor applies to all projects, including the projects that will be governed by the new energy regulators, such as pipelines, offshore renewables, electricity transmission lines. So how do we close that gap between our big international commitments towards smaller decisions having to do with projects? So this is the logical steps that we're supposed to follow. It all starts from the Paris Agreement, and this is very important because there's going to be effort to anchor this climate test into our current Canadian policies, which are not enough to meet our international obligations. From the Paris Agreement, we try to figure out what is our Canadian fair share and what does that imply. From that, we try to develop policies and tools that actually put that into practice. Most of those policies that are listed there have not been adopted by Canada. Then we're supposed to have a strategic assessment of these implications on climate commitments. This is a very important process, strategic assessments. From a Quebec perspective, this is what we do when we want to kill a technology we don't like. So we did strategic assessments of uranium. There was a ban on uranium mining, and then a strategic assessment of shale gas. And, well, we haven't totally won that one, but I would say 95%. So the strategic assessment of climate, it was something that came out of the multi-advisory committee on which I sit, saying that we needed this to think together about how we're going to, do this most complex thing ever. The expert panel on environmental law reform picked up that recommendation, said it was very urgent to do it 3 times. The government said the following summer that it would do it. And this summer, they started a discussion paper about maybe thinking about doing it. So it should happen at some point, if it's not further delayed. And it's like a hot potato keep pushed forward because it's going to be a controversial issue. And if that happens whilst the bill is in the Senate and whilst the Trans Mountain conversation is going on, it's just, I'm not sure the government's going to enjoy that time. So maybe that's why it's being delayed. This is the part of the Metcalfe Report which I prefer. It's a graph that was done by Daniel Horan-Greenford, which is part of our team. And what it represents is the carbon budget allowable for Canada between now and 2100, cumulative emissions that we should be allowed to emit between now and then if we try to be equitable. Now, there's different ways of considering what's equitable, which is why there's a couple of bars on that chart. You can look at historical inequities. You can look at different types of responsibility, capacity to deal with the problems. And so we've surveyed the literature for all available methodologies to calculate a fair share. And so the 8 one on the top are what's considered fair, and the ones below are considered unfair. So what you can see from this graph is most bars on the negative end. Those are negative numbers, which means that according to most, and we've done it for the 1.5 temperature goal and the 2-degree temperature goal. So all but one fair share estimates are negative, which means that Canada's a climate debtor. So in an ideal world, we would stop emitting right now and start giving money to other countries to help them do the transition as well. Okay, only the most lenient version of our fair share is positive, meaning we could still emit some. And even under that scenario, at our current rate of emission, we would have gotten to 0 in 10 years. So that's if we want to be a good country, that's the level of the challenge. These are the policies we do have to try to address this question. I'm going to be quick because I think Dale addressed some of them in his talk. I guess the important thing to say is that our current target towards 2030 is not nearly ambitious enough. It doesn't represent a fair share. It represents more a grandfathering approach to allocation, which means, if we've emitted a lot in the past, we should be allowed to continue, which no philosopher thinks is a version of equity that we can stand by. So all of these policies are not ambitious enough. So they will need to be ratcheted up under Paris, and hopefully that happens very quickly. Under most estimates, Canada's fair share decarbonization deadline has already passed because we are a climate debtor. And we've reviewed modeling exercises done for Canada, and it seems that the earliest technologically feasible deadline to decarbonize would be 2050. So roughly, our obligation is to try to decarbonize as fast as possible and compensate other countries for what we won't be able to do. So if we try to get back to project assessment, the sort of broad thinking that we need to have is to really think in terms of midterm decarbonization, try to think of synergies and co-benefits between different activities that we can do together. Always think of it in the broader context of sustainability and human rights, because there are many things we can do to mitigate climate change that will not be good for human rights, and we should definitely avoid those. Paris needs to be the starting point. That is non-negotiable, and we shouldn't allow it to become based on the Pan-Canadian framework or any of these things. And two other things that are very important to look at is like a more political economy lens to things, because when we allow, let's say, fossil fuel projects or infrastructure to be built, we lengthen our dependencies on those projects. We risk being locked in a carbon economy way beyond when we need to be decarbonized. And most importantly, we create vested interests who want to keep doing what they're doing, and their interest is to oppose the transition that we need. And a reference was done to the transition in Germany, which achieved great things, but they've also been facing a lot of opposition from the coal industry. So, you know, we have the same problem in Canada, but maybe we can help ourselves by not making it worse by building any more projects. The other thing that's important, I think Joanna talked about it yesterday, about our old growth forest and all the carbon that is in the soil. Canada has the second largest stock of peatlands, which is a massive carbon reservoir, and it is very important to preserve. Worryingly, California, when they look at the carbon intensity of our oil that we export there, they consider the emissions that are linked to land use change and the destruction of those carbon sinks. It was also considered in the assessment of the Keystone Pipeline under the Obama administration, but somehow no one in Canada is able to do that. And of course, the oil sands sit on peatland, so it's a massive issue. So I think that's definitely something we need to include in our assessments going forward. You said 5 minutes, eh? Okay. I'll just go very quickly on the hot potato that is downstream emissions of fossil fuel projects. Downstream emissions are the emissions that come out of the combustions in the engines of all the oil that we transport and all that stuff. If we go back to the Energy East saga, when it started in 2014, the NEB said it would not look at indirect emissions of the pipeline. They would just look at the emissions of putting the pipe in the soil, which are minimal if you compare it to the emissions that happen from producing the oil in Alberta and burning the oil once it's exported. More than 100,000 people sent messages to the NEB to say you have to include climate change because it's very important. Weren't you involved with that? Yes. There we go. And then in early 2016, Trudeau was elected. They made these interim measures to try to review some aspects of climate of these pipelines for Energy East and Trans Mountain. However, they only assessed upstream emissions, some upstream emissions that are associated with the oil production in Alberta. And it was, to me, it was a very flawed process, and the evidence wasn't tested. It's just Environment Canada made an assessment and made it public, and no one was able to actually engage with that. So that's the only information we have on that pipeline that we bought, which is worrying. Anywho, back to Energy East. Because of Mike, he made it public that there were a secret meeting between Jean Charest, who was at the time under contract for TransCanada, and the NEB. So that led the review panel to recuse itself. A new panel was appointed, started from scratch. And then in August 2017, I think because they were maybe a bit more open-minded and because of all the public pressure, they finally decided that upstream and downstream emissions would be part of the assessment. And then in October, 3 months later, TransCanada folded its project and abandoned. It's maybe not exactly just because of that, but the consideration of downstream emissions of the oil we export is a very important consideration, because if you take Canada as a whole and you consider all of the emissions associated with the oil that we export, the emissions in other countries of the oil we export, it actually doubles our already very bad greenhouse gas footprint, which is why it's important to include it. Otherwise, we are, I think, being willfully blind. Do I still have time? About out. Very quickly, there's a thing called the social cost of carbon. It's been used a bit in Canada, and what it does is try to assess the damage associated with every ton of carbon that gets emitted in the atmosphere. It's very controversial. It's always underestimated. But it could be maybe a tool that people can understand more readily. People understand money. We're in a capitalist system. So the thinking is maybe the only thing that will unravel a capitalist system are capitalist tools, i.e. trying to demonstrate that we cannot afford to destroy the planet. That's not how I get convinced, but you know, I'm not the one to be convinced here. And it's basically showing the cost of inaction. And at least when project proponents say, hey, my project will bring however millions of dollars, whatever, okay, but you're actually going to result in more millions of dollars of global damage to the rest of the planet. So maybe it's not a net benefit. So I'd consider including that. What's next? Our report will be published. At one point, the federal government will do a strategic assessment of climate. Please get involved. Please tell them it's important and do a good job. It will be a fight to keep the climate factor in Bill C-69 in the Senate, because there is a campaign organized by the oil and gas industry to kill the bill entirely. So, you know, if you want to write to your senators to say it's a great law and we need to pass it, it might be time.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Karine. I think just hearing you speak was bringing back lots of Energy East campaign memories, which is great. I know for you too, right, Tika? So yeah, 100,000 messages were sent with this subject. Like, I remember when we first started talking about we have to pressure the NEB to include climate in its assessment of the pipeline. Oh God, it was like eyes roll back and kind of like, how is this gonna compel people to do, you know, take action? But it was in working with Karine and others who understood it on a policy level and what needed to happen, and then translating that into a simple message. You can't expand the oil sands at a time when the sector is big enough, right? It's just plain common sense that if you build a pipeline, we're gonna get more oil to fill it, right? So sending that message of climate change has to be a factor in whether we decide to build new infrastructure or not. Really simplifying it and then thinking through really creative ways to get that out to people, that worked. And I think Energy East was a good example of how people came together on sort of a policy level, came together in terms of a legal level. How do we challenge this in law? How do we ask for policies that are going to be effective?